Peace, be up on you. My name is Johann Say Tree, and this is Far As I Can Tell, episode 25. The Master Tours the World. Episode 25, this is coming from paper 130, On the Way to Rome. Now, the last episode was The Master, and we pretty much went over, he left Nazareth for the first time around the age of he was about 26, 27, finally left Nazareth, moved to Capernaum, chilled with the Zebedees for a minute, was in a little boat making enterprise, and just becoming an active member in the community in Capernaum. He subsequently left, went on to Jerusalem for a minute during the Passover, I think, and he just so happened to run into two Indians, a wealthy merchant and his son. Now, these Indians were on their way to Rome. They was stopping through Jerusalem and they was on their way to Rome. And they wanted an interpreter for both of them and a tutor for their son on their way to Rome because he had some business to conduct. And the son was 17, like around that age. So they just so happened to run into Jesus, and he eventually agreed to this enterprise. And this enabled him to tour the civilized world at that time and come into contact with all sorts of people. This is a fascinating aspect of his life that's little well known, but it's so important. And this whole, thus far, we kind of just been observing him. You know what I'm saying? We've observed a lot though, like everything from the time he descended from up on high down to this planet. We've seen it all. His parents, his upbringing, his childhood. And, we've heard some words from him here and there, but this is when it starts to really open up. He's been soaking up a lot of game over the years, and he's lived a hard, real life. And now we about to see all the game he got to give. And this is on a personal level. This is what's so interesting about this. This is his personal ministry to people. And yet at the same time, it was planting major seeds for his subsequent public ministry that spread all over the world. I said this before. You can say what you want, but his name rings the most bells on this planet. And it's a reason for that. And part of that had to do with this personal ministry he gave on this tour that lasted almost 2 years. So this is a fascinating, never heard before aspect of his life that is mind-blowing to me. Anyway, we're going to start with paper 130, On the Way to Rome. The tour of the Roman world consumed most of the 28th and the entire 29th year of Jesus' life on earth. Jesus and the two natives from India, Gonad and his son Ganit, left Jerusalem on a Sunday morning, April 26, AD 22. They made their journey according to schedule, and Jesus said goodbye to the father and son in the city of Carax on the Persian Gulf on the 10th day of December the following year, AD 23. From Jerusalem, they went to Caesarea by way of Joppa. At Caesarea, they took a boat for Alexandria. From Alexandria, they sailed for Lycia in Crete. From Crete, they sailed for Carthage, touching at Cyrene. At Carthage, they took a boat for Naples, stopping at Malta, Syracuse, and Messina. From Naples, they went to Capua, whence they traveled by the Appian Way to Rome. After their stay in Rome, they're going to list a whole bunch of cities in the way he came back, stopping through Damascus, and eventually ended up as they said on the Persian Gulf. So I'm going to skip down. It was while working 4 months at Damascus that Jesus had picked up the rudiments of the language spoken by Gonad and Ganit. While there, he had labored much of the time on translations from Greek into one of the languages of India, being assisted by a native of Gonad's home district. So they're saying earlier he picked up on, some of the basics of their language, while at one time he had worked as a scribe in Damascus. On his Mediterranean tour, Jesus spent about half of each day teaching Ganit and acting as interpreter during Gonad's business conferences and social contacts. The remainder of each day, which was at his disposal, he devoted to making those close personal contacts with his fellow men, those intimate associations with the mortals of the realm, which so characterized his activities during these years that just preceded his public ministry. Let us never lose sight of the fact that this is Michael. This is a God, a creator, designer, and upholder of a universe who just so happened to incarnate into some flesh, because part of it was part of his mission. He got these 7 bestowal missions. And so in doing so, he reveals God to man eventually. And this also lets him better understand man, living amongst him, being amongst him. And so this is a huge purpose behind all this. So that's why this is so important. This is God in the flesh on this planet. Literally. And so he's going to carry on like a loving God would, as we about to see. From first-hand observation and actual contact, Jesus acquainted himself with the higher material and intellectual civilization of the Occident and the Levant. The Occident is pretty much the Western world. That's what they used to refer to it back then, like, the Greco-Roman world that was developing, and the Levant. From Gonad and his brilliant son, he learned a great deal about the civilization and culture of India and China. For Gonad himself, a citizen of India, had made 3 extensive trips to the empire of the yellow race. So by his contact with them, he never traveled to China or India. And he was able to learn a lot about the East from them. Ganit, the young man, learned much from Jesus during this long and intimate association. They developed a great affection for each other, and the lad's father many times tried to persuade Jesus to return with them to India. But Jesus always declined, pleading the necessity for returning to his family in Palestine. Part 1, at Joppa, Discourse on Jonah. During their stay in Jonah, Jesus met Godiah, a Philistine interpreter who worked for one Simon, a tanner. Gonad's agents in Mesopotamia had transacted much business with this Simon, so Gonad and his son desired to pay him a visit on their way to Caesarea. While they tarried at Joppa, Jesus and Godiah became warm friends. This young Philistine was a truth seeker. Jesus was a truth giver. He was the truth for that generation on Urantia. When a great truth seeker and a great truth giver meet, the result is a great and liberating enlightenment born of the experience of new truth. I can attest to that. I love, hearing truth from people. Like, that them truths that's dropping on you from time to time, like they just take you to a whole nother plateau, like you don't view the world the same. I live for them moments so I can relate to what they saying. One day after the evening meal, Jesus and the young Philistine strolled down by the sea, and Godiah, not knowing that this quote-unquote scribe of Damascus was so well versed in the Hebrew traditions, pointed out to Jesus the ship landing from which it was reputed that Jonah had embarked on his ill-fated voyage to Tarshish. And when he had concluded his remarks, he asked Jesus this question: "But do you suppose the big fish really did swallow Jonah?" Jesus perceived that this young man's life had been tremendously influenced by this tradition, and that its contemplation had impressed upon him the folly of trying to run away from duty. Jesus therefore said nothing that would suddenly destroy the foundations of Godiah's present motivation for practical living. In a sense, he wasn't just going to shatter the myth because the boy extracted some means of like how to carry on through life. Because, it's about Jonah in the whale and running away from God. So this has impacted him in such a way. And so they just basically saying he wasn't going to just completely shatter that myth on him, but he wanted to teach him a better way. Jesus therefore said nothing that would suddenly destroy the foundation of Godiah's present motivation for practical living. In answering his question, Jesus said, "My friend, we are all Jonahs with lives to live in accordance with the will of God. And at all times, when we seek to escape the present duty of living by running away to far off enticements, we thereby put ourselves in the immediate control of those influences which are not directed by the powers of truth and the forces of righteousness. The flight from duty is the sacrifice of truth." I'm going to skip down a little bit because he tells them some more, but this is like a dense paper. It's a lot to go over. So, again, this paper 130. Godiah was mightily moved by Jesus' teaching, and they talked long into the night by the seaside, and before they went to their lodgings, they prayed together and for each other. This was the same Godiah who listened to the later preaching of Peter, Jesus' apostle in a few years, became a profound believer in Jesus of Nazareth, and held a memorable argument with Peter one evening at the home of Dorcas. And Godiah had very much to do with the final decision of Simon, the wealthy leather merchant, to embrace Christianity. What they're doing is, and this happens a lot, like they're pointing out people who subsequently, this happened before his public ministry. This is a few years before his whole public ministry and before the spread of that explosion, this gospel about this man who had the power over the dead, before all this take place. But they're just showing how the Christian church rise so fast, and a lot of it had to do, again, with him in his personal ministry encountering people. And so when they subsequently hear the same type gospel that they heard from him in the flesh, like it reiterated a bunch of things for them. So this is part of the reason why his ministry had such an explosive growth. People had personal contact with the same person. And they got in parentheses, and this is important. In this narrative of the personal work of Jesus with his fellow mortals on this tour of the Mediterranean, we shall, in accordance with our permission, freely translate his words into modern phraseology current on Urantia at the time of this presentation. Now, again, these papers, and you can do your own research, but they started to appear, and they date back from 1934 AD. So do with that what you will, but they just want you to know, like, all the words that he's giving, they're restating in modern phraseology in English. Jesus' last night with Godiah had to do with a discussion of good and evil. This young Philistine was much troubled by a feeling of injustice because of the presence of evil in the world alongside the good. A lot of people stumble with that, rightfully so. He said, "How can God, if he is infinitely good, permit us to suffer the sorrows of evil? After all, who creates evil?" It was still believed by many in those days that God creates both good and evil, but Jesus never taught such error. In answering this question, Jesus said, "My brother, God is love. Therefore, he must be good, and his goodness is so great and real that it cannot contain the small and unreal things of evil. God is so positively good that there is absolutely no place in him for negative evil. Evil is the immature choosing and the unthinking misstep of those who are resistant to goodness, rejectful of beauty, and disloyal to truth. Evil is only the misadaptation of immaturity or the disruptive and distorting influence of ignorance. Evil is the inevitable darkness which follows upon the heels of the universe rejection of light. Evil is that which is dark and untrue, and which, when consciously embraced and willfully endorsed, becomes sin. Your Father in heaven, by endowing you with the power to choose between truth and error, created the potential negative of the positive way of light and life. But such errors of evil are really non-existent until such a time as an intelligent creature wills their existence by mischoosing the way of life. And then are such evils later exalted into sin by the knowing and deliberate choice of such a willful and rebellious creature. This is why our Father in heaven permits the good and the evil to go along together until the end of life, just as nature allows the wheat and the tares to grow side by side until the harvest. Godiah was fully satisfied with Jesus' answer to his question after the subsequent discussion had made clear to his mind the real meaning of these momentous statements. Whoa. Part 2, at Caesarea. Jesus and his friends tarried in Caesarea beyond the time expected because one of the huge steering paddles of the vessel on which they intended to embark was discovered to be in danger of cleaving. The captain decided to remain in port while a new one was being made. There was a shortage of skilled woodworkers for this task, so Jesus volunteered to assist. During the evenings, Jesus and his friends strolled about on the beautiful wall which served as a promenade around the port. Gannett greatly enjoyed Jesus' explanation of the water system of the city and the technique whereby the tides were utilized to flush the city's streets and sewers. This youth of India was much impressed with the temple of Augustus, situated upon an elevation and surmounted by a colossal statue of the Roman emperor. The second afternoon of their stay, the three of them attended a performance in the enormous amphitheater which could seat 20,000 persons, and that night they went to a Greek play at the theater. These were the first exhibitions of this sort Gannett had ever witnessed, and he asked Jesus many questions about them. On the morning of the third day, they paid a formal visit to the governor's palace, for Caesarea was the capital of Palestine and the residence of the Roman procurator. At their inn, there also lodged a merchant from Mongolia. And since this Far Easterner talked Greek fairly well, Jesus had several long visits with him. This man was much impressed with Jesus' philosophy of life and never forgot his words of wisdom regarding the, quote, living of the heavenly life while on earth by means of daily submission to the will of the heavenly Father. End quote. This merchant was a Taoist, and he had thereby become a strong believer in the doctrine of a universal deity. I'm going to skip down a little bit. While the eastern branch of the early Christian church, having its headquarters at Philadelphia, held more faithfully to the teachings of Jesus than did the Jerusalem brethren, it was regrettable that there was no one like Peter to go into China or like Paul to enter India, where the spiritual soil was then so favorable for planting the seed of the new gospel of the King. Now that's important. That's major what they're saying. Like, this is such a how we have received the little bit that most people know about Jesus came from the Western Occidental world. And so it's been whitewashed off the rip. And that has turned many people off. And so they're just acknowledging the fact that, it didn't really take off in the East like it could and should have. These very teachings of Jesus, as they were held by the Philadelphians, would have made just such an immediate and effective appeal to the minds of the spiritually hungry Asiatic peoples as did the preaching of Peter and Paul in the West. One of the young men who worked with Jesus one day on the steering paddle became much interested in the words which he dropped from hour to hour as they toiled in the shipyard. Remember, he's working on like some paddle on this boat that they were about to take off on this ship. Like, the paddle needs some woodwork and it's taking some days, if not weeks, and he volunteered to labor on it. So one of the young men who worked with Jesus one day on the steering paddle became much interested in the words which he dropped from hour to hour as they toiled in the shipyard. When Jesus intimated that the Father in heaven was interested in the welfare of his children of earth, this young Greek, I guess his name is Alexandria, said, "If the gods are interested in me, then why do they not remove the cruel and unjust foreman of this workshop?" He was startled when Jesus replied, "Since you know the ways of kindness and value justice, perhaps the gods have brought this erring man near that you may lead him into this better way. Maybe you are the salt which is to make this brother more agreeable to all other men. That is, if you have not lost your savor. As it is, this man is your master, and that his evil ways unfavorably influence you. Why not assert your mastery of evil by virtue of the power of goodness and thus become the master of all relations between the two of you? I predict that the good in you could overcome the evil in him if you gave it a fair and living chance. There is no adventure in the course of mortal existence more enthralling than to enjoy the exhilaration of becoming the material life partner with spiritual energy and divine truth in one of their triumphant struggles with error and evil. It is a marvelous and transforming experience to become the living channel of spiritual light to the mortal who sits in spiritual darkness. If you are more blessed with truth than is this man, his need should challenge you. Surely you are not the coward who could stand by on the seashore and watch a fellow man who could not swim perish. How much more of value is this man's soul floundering in darkness compared to his body drowning in water? Damn. Alexandria was mightily moved by Jesus' words. Presently, he told his superior what Jesus had said, and that night they both sought Jesus' advice as to the welfare of their souls. And later on, after the Christian message had been proclaimed in Caesarea, both of these men, one a Greek and the other a Roman, believed Philip's preaching, that was another of his apostles, and became prominent members of the church which he founded. Later, this young Greek was appointed the steward of a Roman centurion Cornelius, who became a believer through Peter's ministry. Annexing continued to minister light to those who sat in darkness until the days of Paul's imprisonment at Caesarea, when he perished by accident in the great slaughter of 20,000 Jews while he ministered to the suffering and dying. Gannett was by this time beginning to learn how his tutor spent his leisure in his unusual personal ministry to his fellow men, and the young Indian set about to find out the motive for these incessant activities. He asked, "Why do you occupy yourself so continuously with these visits with strangers?" And Jesus answered, "Gannett, no man is a stranger to one who knows God. In the experience of finding the Father in heaven, you discover that all men are your brothers. And does it seem strange that one should enjoy the exhilaration of meeting a newly discovered brother? To become acquainted with one's brothers and sisters, to know their problems, and to learn to love them is the supreme experience of living." This was a conference which lasted well into the night, in the course of which the young man requested Jesus to tell him the difference between the will of God and that human mind act of choosing, which is also called will. Very important question. Listen, let's say this again. This was a conference which lasted well into the night, in the course of which the young man requested Jesus to tell him the difference between the will of God and that human mind act of choosing, which is also called will. In substance, Jesus said, the will of God is the way of God, partnership with the choice of God in the face of any potential alternative. To do the will of God, therefore, is the progressive experience of becoming more and more like God. And God is the source and destiny of all that is good and beautiful and true. The will of man is the way of man, the sum and substance of that which the mortal chooses to be and do. Will is the deliberate choice of a self-conscious being which leads to decision conduct based on intelligent reflection. That afternoon, Jesus and Gannett had both enjoyed playing with a very intelligent shepherd dog, and Gannett wanted to know whether the dog had a soul, whether it had a will, and in response to his questions, Jesus said, "The dog has a mind which can know material man, his master, but cannot know God, who is spirit. Therefore, the dog does not possess a spiritual nature and cannot enjoy a spiritual experience. The dog may have a will derived from nature and augmented by training, but such a power of mind is not a spiritual force. Neither is it comparable to the human will, inasmuch as it is not reflective. It is not the result of discriminating higher and moral meanings or choosing spiritual and eternal values. It is the possession of such powers of spiritual discrimination and truth choosing that makes mortal man a moral being, a creature endowed with the attributes of spiritual responsibility and the potential of eternal survival." Jesus went on to explain that it is the absence of such mental powers in the animal which makes it forever impossible for the animal world to develop language in time or to experience anything equivalent to personality survival in eternity. As a result of this day's instructions, Gannett never again entertained belief in the transmigration of the souls of men into the bodies of animals. He was like, man, he broke it down to him, and he basically didn't believe in any sort of reincarnation anymore. And essentially what he was saying is that man has a reflective ability that animals don't. They have mind and they can think, up to a degree though. And there's no afterlife for them. And this is God in the flesh talking. I believe it. Makes sense to me. The next day, Gannet talked all this over with his father, and it was in an answer to Gonad's question. Gonad is the father, Gannet is the son, the Indians. And it was answered to Gonad's question that Jesus explained that, quote, human wills, which are fully occupied with passing only upon temporal decisions having to do with the material problems of animal existence, are doomed to perish in time. Now, let's say that again, because this is everything. Like I be thinking about it, and I'm just sharing real quick with you. Sometimes I really been trying to, as I'm doing this whole series and everything, I'm like, is there anything more important I could be doing? And when I think about it, for me, the ultimate reality of life and death, to me, that's the ultimate reality. Like this is what started this whole journey, is life and death and the permanence of it, one way or another. It's forever. And so I can't think of personally anything of a greater magnitude, anything that's like the ultimate basis for my whole decisions in living on this plane is centered around that reality. And that's, just a personal thing. But what he's saying, I just said all that to say, what he's saying, we just gonna read this again. This is him talking to Gannet's father, Gonad. Human wills which are fully occupied with passing only upon temporal decisions having to do with the material problems of animal existence are doomed to perish in time. Those who make wholehearted moral decisions and unqualified spiritual choices are thus progressively identified with the indwelling and divine spirit, and thereby are they increasingly transformed into the values of eternal survival, unending progression of divine service. Like, look, man, you either gonna go all out in this world and for this world, and it's completely temporary. Whatever you do in this world is a blip in the eternal radar. It's not even that. Like, that shit is barely gonna register at all, because we live in the midst of eternity, whether you like it or not. There's been an eternal past before you got here. We all know that there was time before we showed up and our mama gave birth. Like, time was happening before any of us got here. Time is going to be happening when all of us leave. You have maybe, if you lucky, hell, even if you want to live to be 100, maybe in eternity. That's nothing. This is temporary. The very sun is going to go out one day. All this shit is temporary, and eternity is forever. So he's pretty much breaking down the futility of going all out in this world or anything temporary when you got an eternal choice to make. Like, you really finna trade the world for paradise? That's really what it come down to. So anybody who's choosing the world, you already dead. It was on the same day that we first heard that momentous truth, which, stated in modern terms, would signify, quote, will is that manifestation of the human mind which enables the subjective consciousness to express itself objectively and to experience the phenomenon of aspiring to be godlike, end quote. And it is in the same sense that every reflective and spiritually minded human being can become creative. Part 3, at Alexandria. It had been an eventful visit at Caesarea, and when the boat was ready, Jesus and his two friends departed at noon one day for Alexandria in Egypt. The three enjoyed a most pleasant passage to Alexandria. Gannett was delighted with the voyage and kept Jesus busy answering questions. As they approached the city's harbor, the young man was thrilled by the great lighthouse of Pharos, located on the island which Alexander had joined by a mole to the mainland, thus creating two magnificent harbors and thereby making Alexandria the maritime commercial crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. This great lighthouse was one of the seven wonders of the world and was the forerunner of all subsequent lighthouses. They arose early in the morning to view this splendid, life-saving device of man, and amidst the exclamations of Gannett, Jesus said, "And you, my son, will be like this lighthouse when you return to India. Even after your father is laid to rest, you will become like the light of life to those who sit about you in darkness, showing all who so desire the way to reach the harbor of salvation in safety." And as Gannett squeezed Jesus' hand, he said, "I will." And again, we remark that the early teachers of the Christian religion made a great mistake when they so exclusively turned their attention to the Western civilization of the Roman world. The teachings of Jesus, as they were held by the Mesopotamian believers of the first century, would have been readily received by the various groups of Asiatic religionists. By the fourth hour after landing, they were settled near the eastern end of the long and broad avenue, 100 feet wide and 5 miles long, which stretched out onto the western limits of this city of 1 million people. After the first survey of the city's chief attractions, university, museum, library, the royal mausoleum of Alexander, the palace, temple of Neptune, theater, and gymnasium, Gonard addressed himself to business while Jesus and Gannett went to the library, the greatest in the world. Here were assembled nearly 1 million manuscripts from all the civilized world: Greece, Rome, Palestine, Parthia, India, China, and even Japan. In this library, Gannett saw the largest collection of Indian literature in all the world, and they spent some time here each day throughout their stay in Alexandria. Jesus told Gannett about the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek at this place, and they discussed again and again all the religions of the world. Jesus endeavoring to point out to this young mind the truth in each, always adding, "But Yahweh is the God developed from the revelations of Melchizedek and the covenant of Abraham." The Jews were the offspring of Abraham and subsequently occupied the very land wherein Melchizedek had lived and taught, and from which he sent teachers to all the world. And their religion eventually portrayed a clearer recognition of the Lord God of Israel as the universal Father in heaven than any other world religion. So this was a quote that he just told Gannett, but what he essentially said is, essentially monotheism, the belief in one God as we know it, is largely due to Melchizedek, who came here in what's now modern day Palestine. It was back then, but he came here and chose Abraham as a pupil and taught him to teach about one God and spread this message to the world and to develop a people around that concept, which is what the Hebrews subsequently became. That's what they were entrusted with the task of being, like spiritual torchbearers to the rest of the world. And this is done again because Melchizedek, a spiritual celestial being, incarnated in the flesh, and again chose Abraham to spread this truth of one God. Under Jesus' direction, Gannett made a collection of the teachings of all those religions of the world which recognize the universal deity, even though they might also give more or less recognition to subordinate deities. After much discussion, Jesus and Gannett decided that the Romans had no real God in their religion, that their religion was hardly more than emperor worship. The Greeks, they concluded, had a philosophy, but hardly a religion with a personal God. The mystery cults they discarded because of the confusion of their multiplicity and because their very concepts of deity seemed to be derived from other and older religions. Although these translations were made at Alexandria, Gannett did not finally arrange these selections and add his own personal conclusions until near the end of their sojourn in Rome. So I'm going to skip down some. Basically, they're just gathering a lot of information on the world's religions at the time. Jesus and Gannett spent much time in the museum during their stay in Alexandria. This museum was not a collection of rare objects, but rather a university of fine art, science, and literature. Learned professors here gave daily lectures, and in those times, this was the intellectual center of the Occidental world. Day by day, Jesus interpreted the lectures to Gannett. One day during the second week, the young man exclaimed, "Teacher Joshua, you know more than these professors. You should stand up and tell them the great things you have told me. They are befogged by much thinking. I shall speak to my father and have him arrange it." Jesus smiled, saying, "You are an admiring pupil, but these teachers are not minded that you and I should instruct them. The pride of unspiritualized learning is a treacherous thing in human experience. The true teacher maintains his intellectual integrity by ever remaining a learner." Yo, I'm telling you, bro, ain't nobody else make this up, man. This is him. These are his quotes. Before the fame, before people are following him around, this is the game he was giving individuals. Alexandria was the city of the blended culture of the Occident, and next to Rome, the largest and most magnificent in the world. Here was located the largest Jewish synagogue in the world, the seat of government of the Alexandria Sanhedrin, the 70 ruling elders. In Judaism, they got a clique of people, a group of people called the Sanhedrin, and they're like a ruling body, so to say. They make a lot of decisions and rules and whatnot, and try to enforce rules. Very, it's a lot of, what's the word, man? Red tape, bureaucracy in their religion. And the Sanhedrin are high up there. Among the many men with whom Gonad transacted business was a certain Jewish banker, Alexander, whose brother Philo was a famous religious philosopher of that time. Philo was engaged in a laudable but exceedingly difficult task of harmonizing Greek philosophy and Hebrew theology. Gannett and Jesus talked much about Philo's teachings and expected to attend some of his lectures, but throughout their stay at Alexandria, this famous Hellenistic Jew lay sick abed. Part 4, I'm going to skip down a paragraph. Discourse on reality. The night before they left Alexandria, Gannett and Jesus had a long visit with one of the government professors at the university who lectured on the teachings of Plato. Jesus interpreted for the learned Greek teacher, but injected no teaching of his own in refutation to the Greek philosophy. Gonad was away on business that evening, so after the professor had departed, the teacher and his pupil, Jesus and Gannett, had a long and heart-to-heart talk, about Plato's doctrines. While Jesus gave qualified approval of some of the Greek teachings, which had to do with the theory that the material things of the world are shadowy reflections of invisible but more substantial spiritual realities, he sought to lay a more trustworthy foundation for the lad's thinking. So he began a long dissertation concerning the nature of reality in the universe, in substance, and in modern phraseology. Jesus said to Gannett, I'm not going to read all this, but it's a breakdown, like what they're just essentially saying after they were discussing Plato's teachings, and in essence, like some of Greek philosophy was around the idea that, the material was just a reflection of the spiritual, kind of like a shadow. They're saying Jesus wanted to give him a more firm foundation, like he's adding on to that. And so they got several paragraphs of how they said it, like in modern phraseology, he broke that down. But I'm just going to read a little bit of it. The source of universe reality is the infinite. The material things of finite creation are the time, space, repercussions of the paradise pattern and the universal mind of the eternal God. Causation in the physical world, self-consciousness in the intellectual world, and progressing selfhood in the spirit world. These realities, projected on a universal scale, combined in eternal relatedness and experience with perfection of quality and divinity of value, constitute the reality of the supreme. It gives a little dense. That's why I'm only going to read so much, and it's quite a few paragraphs. But again, he's kind of kicking down the nature of reality to Gannett in a way. So let me skip on now. Although Jesus told all this to the lad in language best suited to his comprehension, at the end of the discussion, Gannett was heavy of eye and was soon lost in slumber. They rose early the next morning to go aboard the boat bound for Lycia on the island of Crete. But before they embarked, the lad had still further questions to ask about evil, to which Jesus replied, evil is a relativity concept. It arises out of the observation of the imperfections which appear in the shadow cast by a finite universe of things and beings, as such a cosmos obscures the living light of the universal expression of the eternal realities of the infinite one. It's pretty. This is another dense breakdown. I'm not going to quite read all of it either. Potential evil is inherent in the necessary incompleteness of the revelation of God as a time-space limited expression of infinity and eternity. The fact of the partial in the presence of the complete constitutes relativity of reality, creates necessity for intellectual choosing, and establishes value levels of spirit recognition and response. Yeah, this is dense, but essentially what's being said is that what we view as evil is sort of relative, because we really can't view the infinite. So our perception off top is limited, and we are caught up in this time space continuum that deity is not. So a lot of it has to do with our vantage point, which is relative to our experience and position in the cosmos. And I don't want to get too deep, but that's essentially, what's kind of being said. So let me skip on down. Part 5 on the island of Crete. The travelers had but one purpose in going to Crete, and that was to play, to walk about over the island and to climb the mountains. The Cretans of that time did not enjoy an enviable reputation among the surrounding peoples. Nevertheless, Jesus and Gannet won many souls to higher levels of thinking and living, and thus laid the foundation for the quick reception of the later gospel teachings when the first preachers from Jerusalem arrived. Jesus loved these Cretans, notwithstanding the harsh words which Paul later spoke concerning them when he subsequently sent Titus to the island to reorganize their churches. On the mountainside in Crete, Jesus had his first long talk with Gonod regarding religion. That's Gannet's father. And the father was much impressed, saying, "No wonder the boy believes everything you tell him. But I never knew they had such a religion even in Jerusalem, much less in Damascus." It was during the island sojourn that Gonod first proposed to Jesus that he go back to India with them, and Gannet was delighted with the thought that Jesus might consent to such an arrangement. One day when Gannet asked Jesus why he had not devoted himself to the work of a public teacher, he said, "My son, everything must await the coming of its time. You were born into the world, but no amount of anxiety and no manifestation of impatience will help you to grow up. You must, in all such matters, wait upon time. Time alone will ripen the green fruit upon the tree. Season follows season, and sundown follows sunrise. Only with the passing of time. I am now on the way to Rome with you and your father, and that is sufficient for today. My tomorrow is wholly in the hands of my Father in heaven." And then he told Gannet the story of Moses and the 40 years of watchful waiting and continued preparation. One thing happened on a visit to Fair Havens, which Gannet never forgot. The memory of this episode always caused him to wish he might do something to change the caste system of his native India. A drunken degenerate was attacking a slave girl on the public highway. When Jesus saw the plight of the girl, he rushed forward and drew the maiden away from the assault of the madman. While the frightened child clung to him, he held the infuriated man at a safe distance by his powerful extended right arm until the poor fellow had exhausted himself, beating the air with his angry blows. Gannon felt a strong impulse to help Jesus handle the affair, but his father forbade him. Though they could not speak the girl's language, she could understand the act of mercy and gave token of her heartfelt appreciation as they all three escorted her home. This was probably as near a personal encounter with his fellows as Jesus had ever had throughout his entire life in the flesh. But he had a difficult task that evening, trying to explain to Gannet why he did not smite the drunken man. Gannet thought this man should have been struck at least as many times as he had struck the girl. Part 6. The young man who was afraid. While they were up in the mountains, Jesus held a long talk with a young man who was fearful and downcast. Failing to derive comfort and courage from association with his fellows, this youth had sought the solitude of the hills. He had grown up with a feeling of helplessness and inferiority. These natural tendencies had been augmented by numerous difficult circumstances which the lad had encountered as he grew up. Notably, the loss of his father when he was 12 years of age. As they met, Jesus said, "Greetings, my friend. Why so downcast on such a beautiful day? If something has happened to distress you, perhaps I can in some manner assist you. At any rate, it affords me real pleasure to proffer my services." The young man was disinclined to talk, and so Jesus made a second approach to his soul, saying, "I understand you come up in these hills to get away from folks. So, of course, you do not want to talk with me. But I would like to know whether you are familiar with these hills. Do you know the direction of the trails? And perchance, could you inform me as to the best route to Phoenix? Now, this youth was very familiar with these mountains, and he really became much interested in telling Jesus the way to Phoenix. So much so that he marked out all the trails on the ground and fully explained every detail. But he was startled and made curious when Jesus, after saying goodbye and making as if he were taking leave, suddenly turned to him, saying, I well know you wish to be left alone with your disconsolation, but it would be neither kind nor fair for me to receive such generous help from you as to how best to find my way to Phoenix, and then unthinkingly to go away from you without making the least effort to answer your appealing request for help and guidance regarding the best route to the goal of destiny which you seek in your heart while you tarry here on the mountainside. As you so well know the trails to Phoenix, having traversed them many times, so do I well know the way to the city of your disappointed hopes and thwarted ambitions. And since you have asked me for help, I will not disappoint you. The youth was almost overcome, but he managed to stammer out, But I did not ask you for anything. And Jesus, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder, said, No, son, not with words, but with longing looks did you appeal to my heart. My boy, no, to one who loves his fellows, there is an eloquent appeal for help in your countenance of discouragement and despair. Sit down with me while I tell you of the service trails and happiness highways which lead from the sorrows of self to the joys of loving activities in the brotherhood of men and in the service of the God of heaven. So they out in Crete. He came across this young man in the mountains who was trying to get away from it all, practically depressed. By this time, the young man very much desired to talk with Jesus, and he knelt at his feet, imploring Jesus to help him, to show him the way of escape from his world of personal sorrow and defeat. Said Jesus, My friend, arise, stand up like a man. You may be surrounded with small enemies and be retarded by many obstacles, but the big things and the real things of this world and the universe are on your side. The sun rises every morning to salute you, just as it does the most powerful and prosperous man on earth. Look, you have a strong body and powerful muscles. Your physical equipment is better than the average. Of course, it is just about useless while you sit here on the mountainside and grieve over your misfortunes, real and fancied. But you could do great things with your body if you would hasten off to where great things are waiting to be done. You were trying to run away from your unhappy self, but it cannot be done. You and your problems of living are real. You cannot escape them as long as you live. But look again. Your mind is clear and capable. Your strong body has an intelligent mind to direct it. Set your mind at work to solve its problems. Teach your intellect to work for you. Refuse longer to be dominated by fear like an unthinking animal. Your mind should be your courageous ally in the solution of your life problems rather than your being, as you have been, its abject fear slave and the bondservant of depression and defeat. But most valuable of all, your potential of real achievement is the spirit which lives within you and which will stimulate and inspire your mind to control itself and activate the body if you will release it from the fetters of fear and thus enable your spiritual nature to begin your deliverance from the evils of inaction by the power presence of living faith. And then forthwith will this faith vanquish fear of men by the compelling presence of that new and all-dominating love of your fellows, which will so soon fill your soul to overflowing because of the consciousness which has been born in your heart that you are a child of God. This day, my son, you are to be reborn, reestablished as a man of faith, courage, and devoted service to man for God's sake. And when you become so readjusted to life within yourself, you become likewise readjusted to the universe. You have been born again, born of the Spirit, and henceforth will your whole life become one of victorious accomplishment. Trouble will, damn, trouble will invigorate you. Disappointment will spur you on. Difficulties will challenge you, and obstacles will stimulate you. Arise, young man. Say farewell to the life of cringing fear and fleeing cowardice. Hasten back to duty and live your life in the flesh as a son of God, immortal. Hasten back to duty and live your life in the flesh as a son of God, a mortal dedicated to the ennobling service of man on earth and destined to the superb and eternal service of God in eternity. And his youth, fortune, subsequently became the leader of the Christians in Crete and a close associate of Titus in his labors for the uplift of the Cretan believers. Yo, sometime that happens with me in this narrative. Like, yo, it happened a lot, actually. Let's see. All right. The travelers were truly rested and refreshed when they made ready about noon one day to sail for Carthage in northern Africa, stopping for 2 days at Cyrene. It was here that Jesus and Gannet gave first aid to a lad named Rufus who had been injured by the breakdown of a loaded ox cart. They carried him home to his mother, and his father, Simon, little dreamed that the man whose cross he subsequently bore by orders of the Roman soldier was the stranger who once befriended his son. Did you hear that? Wow. Part 7, at Carthage, Discourse on Time and Space. We winding on down. Most of the time en route to Carthage, Jesus talked with his fellow travelers about things social, political, and commercial. Hardly a word was said about religion. For the first time, Gonod and Gannet discovered that Jesus was a good storyteller, and they kept him busy telling tales about his early life in Galilee. They also learned that he was reared in Galilee and not in either Jerusalem or Damascus. When Gannet inquired what one could do to make friends, having noticed that the majority of persons whom they chanced to meet were attracted to Jesus, the teacher said, become interested in your fellows, learn how to love them, and watch for the opportunity to do something for them which you are sure they want done. And then he quoted the olden Jewish proverb, a man who would have friends must show himself friendly. At Carthage, Jesus had a long and memorable talk with a Mithraic priest about immortality, about time and eternity. This Persian had been educated at Alexandria, and he really desired to learn from Jesus. Put into the words of the day, in substance, Jesus said in answer to his many questions, this is some more deep, dense, master teaching, which I suggest you read towards it's part 7 in paper 130. But I'm not gonna read all of it. I'm just gonna pick a couple sentences though. Again, he's talking to a educated dude in Alexandria or from Alexandria. Well, somebody who's been educated in Alexandria, they're talking about time and eternity. And they're saying in so many words, in modern day phrasing, Jesus said, time is the stream of flowing temporal events perceived by creature consciousness. Time is a name given to the succession arrangement whereby events are recognized and segregated. The universe of space is a time-related phenomenon as it is viewed from any interior position outside of the fixed abode of paradise. The motion of time is only revealed in relation to something which does not move in space as a time phenomenon. In the universe of universes, paradise and its deities transcend both time and space. On the inhabited worlds, human personality, and they have in parentheses, indwelt and oriented by the Paradise Father Spirit, in the parentheses, is the only physically related reality which can transcend the material sequence of temporal events. Basically, the spirit indwelling you is the only thing above time and space. In this temporal realm, this material realm we inhabit. Animals do not sense time as does man, and even to man, because of his sectional and circumscribed view, that means cut off, time appears as a succession of events. But as man ascends, as he progresses inward, the enlarging view of this event procession is such that it is discerned more and more in its wholeness. That which formerly appeared as a succession of events then will be viewed as a whole and perfectly related cycle. In this way, will circular simultaneity increasingly displace the one-time consciousness of the linear sequence of events. Who else dropping game like that? He's saying, the longer you live, the more you will sin, the less you view time as this succession of events, and you start to see the wholeness of it. I'm gonna skip toward the end. There was a lot being said though. Part 8, on the way to Naples and Rome. The first stop on the way to Italy was at the Island of Malta. Here, Jesus had a long talk with a downhearted and discouraged young man named Claudius. This fellow had contemplated taking his life, but when he had finished talking with the scribe of Damascus, he said, I will face life like a man. I am through playing the coward. I will go back to my people and begin all over again. Shortly, he became an enthusiastic preacher of the Cynics, and still later on, he joined hands with Peter in proclaiming Christianity in Rome and Naples. And after the death of Peter, he went on to Spain preaching the gospel. But he never knew that the man who inspired him in Malta was the Jesus whom he subsequently proclaimed the world's deliverer. At Syracuse, they spent the full week. The notable event of their stop here was the rehabilitation of Ezra, the backslidden Jew who kept the tavern where Jesus and his companions stopped. Ezra was charmed by Jesus' approach and asked him to help him come back to the faith of Israel. He expressed his hopelessness by saying, I want to be a true son of Abraham, but I cannot find God. Said Jesus, if you truly want to find God, that desire is in itself evidence that you have already found him. Your trouble is not that you cannot find God, for the Father has already found you. Your trouble is simply that you do not know God. Have you not read in the prophet Jeremiah? You shall seek me and find me when you shall search for me with all your heart. And again, does not this same prophet say, and I will give you a heart to know me, that I am the Lord, and you shall belong to my people, and I will be your God. And have you not also read in the scriptures where it says, He looks down upon men, and if any will say, I have sinned and perverted that which was right, and it profited me not, then will God deliver that man's soul from darkness, and he shall see the light. And Ezra found God, and to the satisfaction of his soul. Later, this Jew, in association with a well-to-do Greek proselyte, built the first Christian church in Syracuse. At Messina, they stopped for only one day, but that was long enough to change the life of a small boy, a fruit vendor, of whom Jesus brought fruit and in turn fed with the bread of life. The lad never forgot the words of Jesus and the kindly look which went with them when, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder, he said, Farewell, my lad. Be of good courage as you grow up to manhood, and after you have fed the body, learn how also to feed the soul. And my Father in heaven will be with you and go before you. The lad became a devotee of the Mithraic religion and later on turned to the Christian faith. At last they reached Naples and felt they were not far from their destination, Rome. Gonad had much business to transact in Naples, and aside from the time Jesus was required as interpreter, he and Gannett spent their leisure visiting and exploring the city. Gannett was becoming adept at citing those who appeared to be in need. They found much poverty in this city and distributed many alms. But Gannett never understood the meaning of Jesus' words when, after he had given a coin to a street beggar, he refused to pause and speak comfortingly to the man. Said Jesus, why waste words upon one who cannot perceive the meaning of what you say? The Spirit of the Father cannot teach and save one who has no capacity for sonship. What Jesus meant was that the man was not of normal mind, that he lacked the ability to respond to Spirit leading. There was no outstanding experience in Naples. Jesus and the young man thoroughly canvassed the city and spread good cheer with many smiles upon hundreds of men, women, and children. From here, they went by way of Capua to Rome, making a stop of 3 days at Capua. By the Appian Way, they journeyed on beside their pack animals toward Rome, all three being anxious to see this mistress of empire and the greatest city in all the world. Yo, this has been from paper 130. The master tours the world. I mean, you know, the world as it was known back then. This is huge. The Roman Empire is spread out. And that's just, you know, they were the latest in a long string of civilizations. And this was a big deal in his day. And so they visited the seat of it, the Rome. Anyway, man, yo, as far as I can tell, some of the realest shit ever, period. But yeah, man, we'll see y'all next time. Peace.